My name is Eleanor Whitford, and just 3 minutes after the ink dried on my divorce papers, I watched my former mother-in-law sweep into the mansion as if she were a queen entering her throne room. She didn't come alone. On her arm, as brazen as the midday sun, was Clara, my ex-husband's mistress. Vivian, that's her name, didn't even look at me. She tossed her fur stole across the back of a chair as though she already owned the place. Her voice rang out in that sharp, icy tone I had known for years. "From now on, this mansion belongs to you, Clara," she announced as though she were gifting away a crown jewel. Clara's lips curled in a satisfied smirk, her manicured fingers tracing along the banister that had once been polished by my own hands when the staff was short. She looked around the grand foyer like a cat claiming territory, eyes sparkling with victory. I stood quietly, a strange calm settling over me. After everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayal, the endless humiliations, I was almost too numb to react. My life, my marriage, my dignity had already been stripped from me in court just moments earlier. Or so they thought. It was at that precise moment that a voice cut through the thick air. It wasn't mine. It was Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper who had served this family for decades, and who had stood by my side when no one else would. Her words, calm and deliberate, would send icy chills through the room. But I'll come back to that. First, you need to understand how we arrived at this moment, how a woman like me, who once believed in love and loyalty, ended up standing in the ruins of her marriage, watching her mother-in-law hand my life over to the woman who had destroyed it. I wasn't born into grandeur. My childhood was small-town ordinary, the scent of fresh pies cooling on windowsills, Sunday sermons that lasted too long, and a father who taught me that honesty was the only currency that never lost value. When I met Richard Whitford at a charity gala where I was volunteering, I thought I had stumbled into a fairy tale. He was handsome in a polished way, the kind of man who drew attention simply by entering a room. But more than his looks, it was the way he listened that captured me, or at least, the way I thought he did. He asked questions about my life, my work, my dreams. He made me feel like the center of his universe. When he slipped a ring on my finger 2 years later, I believed my story was one of happily ever after. Of course, fairy tales rarely survive the harsh light of reality. And reality came in the form of Vivian Whitford, Richard's formidable mother. She embodied the old-world pearl's power and an unshakable belief that money defined worth. From the very first dinner at the Whitford estate, she made her disapproval clear. Her comments were never shouted, never vulgar. Instead, they were delivered like little paper cuts, each one small but stinging. "That dress is quaint," she'd murmur across the table. Or, "Eleanor, dear, perhaps you'd feel more comfortable helping the staff in the kitchen." Laughter would ripple around her like trained applause, and Richard would smile nervously, never daring to contradict her. Still, I held my head high. I told myself that love was enough, that Richard would see my worth even if his mother did not. I poured my energy into being the kind of wife who supported her husband, who cared for their home, who made the mansion feel less like a museum and more like a place where life could be lived. But little by little, I felt myself disappearing. One memory stands out like a warning bell I had ignored. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the storm clouds turn the sky a deep, bruised gray. I had gone to the library, my favorite room in the mansion, to escape the suffocating silence. I found Mrs. Whitmore there, dusting the shelves. She had been with the Whitfords for nearly 30 years, a steady presence who seemed to know every secret that echoed within those walls. "You're not yourself, ma'am," she said gently, setting her feather duster aside. Her eyes, kind but sharp, studied me with the care of someone who had seen too many young brides wilt under Vivian's rule. I tried to laugh it off, but my voice cracked. "Sometimes I feel like I'm on trial here, like nothing I do is ever enough." She gave me a look that was part sympathy, part warning. The Whitfords don't value people the way your father taught you to, dear. They value possession, appearances. But don't let them make you forget who you are. At the time, her words comforted me, though I didn't fully grasp their weight. Now, standing in that foyer years later watching Vivian hand my home to Clara, those words came roaring back. The descent into betrayal wasn't a sudden fall. It was a slow unraveling. Richard's late nights at the office. His phone calls cut short when I entered the room, the faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine clinging to his suit jacket. I told myself I was imagining things, that the pressure from his mother was wearing us both thin. But deep down I knew. I knew when he stopped looking at me the way he once did. I knew when his laughter came more easily in the presence of others than it ever did with me. And I knew when I found a gold bracelet tucked into the pocket of his coat, delicate and feminine, engraved with initials that were not my own. Clara. The name would soon become a brand seared into my memory. And so when Vivian swept into the mansion that day with Clara on her arm declaring the estate hers, it wasn't a shock. It was a performance, a final act in the theater of cruelty that had been playing for years. But what they didn't realize, not Vivian, not Clara, not even Richard, was that their script had a twist they hadn't rehearsed for. And the first line of that twist belonged to Mrs. Whitmore, the woman they had always overlooked. Her words, calm, deliberate, unyielding, were about to shatter the illusion of power they thought they held. And I would finally reclaim what was mine. Before that fateful day, before courtrooms and cold signatures and declarations of ownership, there was once a girl who believed in love. That girl was me. I grew up in a town where everyone knew your name, where the summers smelled of cut grass and gasoline, from old lawnmowers, and winters meant patchwork quilts and the slow drip of melting icicles. My father, Harold, was a carpenter, not wealthy, but respected. He used to say, "Eleanor, money builds houses, but honesty builds homes." I carried that phrase like a prayer. It shaped the way I looked at people, the way I believed kindness could soften even the hardest edges. It's what I carried with me the night I met Richard Whitford. It was a charity gala, one of those glittering evenings in the city where chandeliers cast diamonds of light over crystal glasses and laughter floated like smoke. I wasn't a guest, I was working, pouring wine and making sure every table had what it needed. I wore a simple black dress, not silk, but cotton, my hair tied back because I couldn't afford a stylist. That's when I noticed him, tall, clean-cut, the kind of confidence that comes from a life of privilege. Richard caught my eye as I set down a tray of canapés. He smiled and, unlike the others that evening, he didn't glance past me as though I were invisible. He asked me my name. He asked me why I was there. And when I told him I was saving money to finish my teaching degree, his brow lifted with what looked like admiration. For a young woman like me, raised on modest means, that kind of attention was intoxicating. Our courtship was swift. Richard was generous with his charm, and, in those early months, I believed it was genuine. He sent flowers to my apartment, the kind that filled the entire room with scent. He took me to dinners where the menus had no prices and, though I sometimes felt out of place, he always touched my hand across the table and said, "You belong here." When he proposed beneath a canopy of fairy lights in a rose garden, I said yes without hesitation. My father cried with pride. My friends envied me. And in my heart, I thought I was stepping into a life where love would be enough to bridge the gap between worlds. But the first warning came at our engagement dinner. The Whitford mansion was breathtaking, a relic of old money with marble floors that seemed to stretch forever, and portraits of stern ancestors staring down from gilded frames. I walked in holding Richard's arm and tried to ignore the pit in my stomach. At the head of the dining table sat Vivian Whitford. Her pearls gleamed like armor, her posture straight as a blade. She looked at me with eyes that assessed, measured, and dismissed all at once. "So this is Eleanor," she said, her lips barely curving into what might have been a smile. "Richard tells me you're teaching." "Yes, ma'am." I replied, my voice steady, though my hands trembled in my lap. I've always loved working with children. She tilted her head as though I had said something quaint, something laughably small. How charming. Though I imagine it doesn't leave much time for finer pursuits. The table chuckled softly, a polite ripple of agreement. I felt my cheeks burn, but Richard squeezed my hand under the table. Mother, he said lightly, Eleanor's passion is one of the reasons I love her. It should have comforted me, but his tone wasn't defiant, it was appeasing, as though he were a boy seeking permission. The weeks that followed were filled with similar moments, small, sharp reminders that I was an outsider. At fittings for the wedding dress, Vivian clucked her tongue and muttered, "Too plain." At luncheons, she would lean toward her friends and whisper within earshot, "Such simple tastes." Richard rarely confronted her. Instead, he smoothed things over, promised me that she'd warm up in time. "She's just protective," he'd say, brushing hair from my face. "You're the first woman I've ever brought home. Give her patience." And because I wanted so badly to believe in us, I swallowed my pride. But not everyone in that house treated me like I was invisible. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, became my quiet ally. She had been with the family for nearly 3 decades, a woman of 60 with hair the color of snow and eyes that seemed to see through everything. Unlike the others, she never looked at me with judgment. One afternoon I found her in the conservatory trimming roses. The air smelled of damp soil and green life. I confessed in a moment of weakness how small Vivian made me feel. She put down her shears, wiped her hands on her apron, and said softly, "Don't let them convince you your worth is something they can decide. These walls echo with pride, but they've never known humility. That is your strength, dear. Don't lose it." Her words clung to me, though at the time I didn't fully realize how much I would need them. The wedding came and went in a blur of white lace and clinking glasses. From the outside, it was perfect. Inside, I felt the faint tremors of something fragile, something already cracking. Still, I told myself love would hold us together. I moved into the Whitford mansion, its endless corridors cold despite the sunlight. I decorated corners with fresh flowers, baked pies in the kitchen, tried to bring warmth where there was only grandeur. For a time, it worked. Richard and I shared laughter in stolen moments. He told me I made the mansion feel alive again. But Vivian's presence was constant, her shadow long. She inserted herself into everything: how we spent holidays, how money was allocated, even how the staff addressed me. To her, I was never Mrs. Whitford. I was Richard's wife, said with a tone that stripped me of identity. Still, I held on. I wanted so desperately to prove myself worthy of their acceptance, though deep down I should have known nothing I did would ever be enough. It is strange looking back now to realize how blind love can make us. I mistook Richard's silence for loyalty. I mistook Vivian's cruelty for tradition. And I mistook endurance for strength. But strength is not the ability to suffer endlessly. It is the ability to stand up and say enough. That day was still far ahead of me. For now, I was a woman learning how to smile through the cracks, unaware of just how wide they were about to split. If the wedding had been a fairy tale, then the marriage that followed was more like a slow drip of water carving away at stone. At first, you don't notice the erosion. The days blur into one another's shared meals, small kisses before work, laughter on evenings when the world feels gentle. But little by little cracks form. And in the Whitford household, those cracks weren't accidents of nature, they were chiseled in by Vivian's hand. The early months after the wedding were filled with moments of joy that I clung to like lifelines. Richard and I would sneak away from the suffocating grandeur of the dining room to eat dinner on the back porch. We'd sit with paper plates on our laps, listening to cicadas buzz, laughing like 2 young lovers rather than heirs to an empire. In those moments, I glimpsed the man I had fallen in love with. But as soon as we stepped back inside, reality would reclaim him. Vivian had a way of orchestrating life in the mansion as though it were her private stage. At breakfast, she would ask Richard about company shares, board meetings, and family investments, pointedly excluding me from the conversation. If I tried to contribute, she would smile thinly and say, "That's sweet, Eleanor. But leave business matters to those who understand them." Richard would chuckle awkwardly, change the subject, and later whisper to me, "Don't take it personally." But how could I not? I remember one evening in particular. The family hosted a dinner with influential partners. I wore a navy gown, simple but elegant, with pearls that had belonged to my mother. As I entered the dining room, Vivian's eyes swept over me like a scanner. "Pearls," she remarked loud enough for the guests to hear. "How quaint. Most women wear diamonds at such events." The laughter that followed was like glass breaking in my chest. I smiled politely, excused myself early, and cried in the privacy of the powder room. Later, Richard found me. His brow furrowed, his voice low. "You can't let her get to you like that. She humiliates me in front of everyone." I whispered, my throat tight. "And you say nothing." He sighed, kissed my forehead, and said, "It's easier this way. Trust me." That night, I realized something chilling. Richard's loyalty was not to me. It was to peace with his mother, no matter the cost. Over time, the isolation grew heavier. Friends stopped visiting. They said the mansion felt unwelcoming. My career, the teaching degree I had once dreamed of, was dismissed as unnecessary by the Whitfords. "You don't need to work," Vivian had declared. "Your duty is to support Richard." At first I resisted. I filled out applications in secret, tucked away lesson plans in drawers. But Richard found them one evening and grew uncharacteristically stern. "Mother's right," he said. "You don't need to work. It would be embarrassing for the family if people thought I couldn't provide." Embarrassing? The word stung worse than a slap. So I relented. I folded my dreams into silence and tried to mold myself into what they wanted. But in that silence, something inside me began to wither. And then came Clara. Her name entered the household like a whisper at first. I overheard it from the staff mentions of Miss Clara attending events with Richard when I wasn't present. At dinners, Vivian would drop hints about young women who understand refinement. I confronted Richard one night, unable to hold my tongue any longer. "Who is Clara?" He blinked too quickly, his glass of scotch paused halfway to his lips. "Just a colleague." Mother exaggerates. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Weeks later, I attended a charity luncheon. Across the room, I saw her Clara. Tall, striking, with a beauty that announced itself like perfume before she even spoke. She laughed easily, leaning too close to Richard. He caught sight of me, startled, and for a moment guilt flickered across his face. Vivian, seated beside me, leaned in and whispered, "Now that's the kind of woman who knows how to stand at Richard's side." It was deliberate. A knife twisted slowly. I left the luncheon early, the taste of bile in my throat. Mrs. Whitmore noticed my quiet unraveling. She would linger in the halls longer than usual, pausing with her dust cloth or tea tray. One afternoon, she stopped me as I walked through the foyer, my steps heavy as stone. "Ma'am," she said softly, "don't let their cruelty make you question your worth. They play their games, but you have a goodness they cannot touch." Tears welled in my eyes, but I nodded. Her words were an anchor in waters determined to drown me. Still, Richard slipped further away. Business trips grew longer, excuses thinner. He carried his phone like a secret, shielding it from my eyes. Nights once spent in shared laughter became nights I spent alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering where my husband truly was. The final straw came one rainy evening. I had stayed awake waiting for him. At 2 a.m, the door opened and he stumbled in, smelling faintly of champagne and perfume that wasn't mine. In his coat pocket, as I later discovered, was a bracelet. Gold. Engraved with the initials C.H. Clara Harrison. My hands trembled as I held it. My heart didn't shatter all at once. It cracked quietly like ice breaking under too much weight. In the weeks that followed, Clara's presence was no longer whispered, it was flaunted. Vivian invited her to dinners, praised her intellect, her style, her poise. At times, I felt like a ghost at my own table watching them laugh together as though I had never existed. Richard's silence was complicity. His eyes slid away when mine searched for answers. And though he never said the words, his choice was clear. I had become invisible, the inconvenient wife tolerated until I could be disposed of. But what none of them realized, not Richard, not Vivian, not Clara, was that invisibility is dangerous. It allows you to watch, to plan, to prepare. And while they laughed and schemed, I was listening. I was learning. And in that quiet learning, I was slowly finding the strength to rise. There's a saying my father used to tell me: when someone shows you who they are, don't wait for them to prove it twice. For a long time, I ignored that wisdom. I excused Richard's absences, rationalized Vivian's cruelty, and convinced myself Clara was nothing more than a passing temptation. But truth has a way of revealing itself, and once it does, you can't unsee it. The revelation came one crisp autumn evening. The leaves had turned fire red and gold, drifting across the long driveway like confetti. I was returning from visiting my father, who had fallen ill. My mind was heavy, my heart already fragile. As I approached the mansion, I saw the faint glow of lights in the drawing room. Laughter carried through the night air, muffled but unmistakable. I stepped inside quietly, the soles of my shoes brushing against marble. And there they were, Richard seated on the sofa, his hand resting casually on Clara's knee. Vivian perched nearby, sipping brandy as if she were a proud chaperone. For a moment I froze. It felt like walking into a dream you desperately want to wake from. Eleanor, Vivian's voice sliced the silence, cold and sharp. "You're back early." Richard jerked upright, his face paling, but Clara didn't move. Her smirk was steady, her gaze challenging. "I see," I whispered. My hands trembled, but my voice did not. "You've invited her into my home." Vivian rose, her pearls glinting under the chandelier. "This was never truly your home, Eleanor. You may have married my son, but you never belonged in this family." The words landed heavier than any slap. My chest tightened, yet somewhere deep inside anger began to kindle. That night, I packed a small bag and left for my father's house. Richard didn't stop me. He didn't even follow me to the door. Days later, he arrived not alone, but with Vivian. They brought papers. Divorce papers. "This is best for everyone," Richard muttered, unable to meet my eyes. Vivian, however, looked straight at me. "Sign them quickly and quietly, dear. The less fuss you make, the more dignified this will be." Besides, she added, a sly smile tugging her lips, "Richard has already found happiness with Clara. It's time you accept your place." Her words seared into me, but I refused to let her see my tears. With steady hands, I took the papers, though I did not sign them that day. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings and whispered gossip. Word spread quickly through the circles we inhabited: Richard Whitford leaving his wife for another woman. Friends I thought loyal turned their backs, afraid to anger the powerful Vivian. Invitations ceased. My phone went quiet. Only Mrs. Whitmore stayed by my side. She brewed tea when the nights felt unbearable, reminded me to eat when my grief threatened to consume me. "They may strip you of status, but they cannot strip you of your soul," she told me gently. It was her steadiness that kept me from breaking completely. The divorce hearing was a theater of humiliation. Vivian sat in the front row, her chin raised proudly, Clara beside her like a crowned victor. Richard avoided my gaze as lawyers argued over assets and property. When my attorney mentioned the mansion, Vivian laughed softly, audible enough for everyone to hear. "That house has always belonged to our family," she declared, her voice dripping with disdain. "Eleanor was merely occupying it." I bit my tongue, refusing to rise to her bait. Inside, though, a plan was forming, faint at first, but growing clearer with each sneer that crossed her lips. At last the day came when the judge's gavel fell. The marriage was over. Years of sacrifice, loyalty, and love erased with one final stroke. Afterward, Richard didn't speak to me. Clara's smile gleamed like victory. Vivian brushed past me as though I were nothing more than dust in her path. And then, just 3 minutes later, they arrived at the mansion. I returned as well, not to beg, not to cling, but because I had unfinished business. I stood in the foyer, numb yet resolute, as Vivian pushed open the doors and ushered Clara inside. "This mansion," she announced grandly, her voice echoing against marble and glass, "is yours now, Clara. From this day forward, you are the true lady of the Whitford estate." Clara beamed her heels, clicking confidently across the floor. She trailed her fingers along the staircase rail as though already envisioning her reign. But before I could utter a word, a calm voice rose behind me. It was Mrs. Whitmore. "Pardon me, madam," she said, her tone steady yet edged with quiet fire. "But that is not true." The room fell silent. Vivian turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" The housekeeper stepped forward, her posture regal despite her simple uniform. "This mansion does not belong to Richard, nor to Clara. It belongs to Eleanor." Gasps rippled through the room. Clara's smirk faltered. Richard finally looked at me, confusion etched across his features. Vivian's face flushed crimson. "How dare you?" But Mrs. Whitmore did not flinch. She continued, voice calm, resolute, undeniable. And in that moment I realized the breaking point was no longer mine alone. It was theirs. For a beat, no one moved. The grandfather clock in the hall clicked with infuriating calm, marking off seconds that felt like a lifetime. Vivian's knuckles whitened around the stem of her brandy glass. Clara's hand slipped from the banister. Richard looked from me to the housekeeper as if Mrs. Whitmore had suddenly started speaking a language he didn't understand. "This is absurd," Vivian snapped, finding her voice first. "You are staff, Mrs. Whitmore. You do not decide matters of title." "I don't," Mrs. Whitmore agreed evenly. "The recorder's office does, as does the bank that holds the security instrument on this property." She turned her clear gray eyes toward Richard. "And as does the trust you signed into without reading 18 months ago." Richard blinked. "What trust?" I'd never seen Mrs. Whitmore indulge in anything like theater, but a hush fell as she slipped a thick, cream-colored envelope from the satchel she'd brought in with the morning mail. She did not hand it to Vivian. She handed it to me. My name, Eleanor Grace Whitford, was written across the flap in my father's firm carpenter's script. The sight of it lanced my heart. I swallowed, then passed the envelope to the attorney, who had stepped in through the side entrance at my signal a moment earlier, Mr. Hale, sand gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, patience of a saint. He withdrew a stack of documents, the first two bearing the county seal in embossed gold. "Madam," he said to Vivian, with the kind of politeness that is a velvet glove over iron, 18 months ago, "your son executed a deed of trust conveying a security interest in this residence to a holding entity called Elm and River Trust, LLC. 6 months later, he executed a deed in lieu of foreclosure to be held in escrow and recorded upon default." Vivian laughed, a brittle sound. "Default on what? We are Whitfords." She said it like an incantation. "On the note," Mr. Hale replied. "The note that kept your son's company afloat when his hedge position soured. The note that was purchased quietly from the bank last winter by the Harold Grace Trust." He glanced at me with the faintest nod. "Established years ago by Ms. Whitford's late father." Richard's lips parted. "You bought the note?" His voice cracked on the last word. "Not me," I said softly, my throat tight at the mention of my father. "My father did. He didn't leave me wealth. He left me wisdom and a life insurance policy I never touched." When the numbers stopped adding up and I couldn't make Richard listen, I called Mr. Hale. We looked at options that were legal and quiet. "You think you can steal my home with paperwork?" Clara's bravado faltered. Her eyes cut to the open front door as if gauging the distance to flight. "This is not theft," Mr. Hale said. It is contract. Your fiancé pledged the property failed covenants and triggered the escrowed deed by default last month. The county recorded it at 9:30 this morning. He held up a stamped copy raised seal catching the foyer light. As of today, title stands in the name of the Harold Grace Trust, of which Ms. Whitford is the sole lifetime beneficiary and trustee. Silence bludgeoned the room. Vivian's brandy glass clinked against the sideboard as she set it down with a trembling hand. Color drained from her face so completely, I thought her pearl necklace might be the only thing left keeping her upright. No. This house has been in our family since your grandfather lost it in the Depression, and it was repurchased by your husband's brokerage through a shell, then refinanced 5 times. Mrs. Whitmore finished not unkindly. I remember because I cataloged every closing for the household files. Times change, Mrs. Whitford. Records do not. Richard raked a hand through his hair, stunned. Why didn't you tell me? I met his eyes. For once, I did not look away. I tried. You wouldn't hear anything that didn't sound like your mother's voice. Clara recovered enough to sneer. So you're rich now? Congratulations. Must be nice to play hero while you had your housekeeper snoop for you. Mrs. Whitmore's chin lifted a fraction. I did not snoop. I witnessed. I was present when your fiancé signed the escrow deed, Miss Harrison. Mr. Whitford asked me to bring tea as a prop. He thought it would make me invisible. It did not. A flush crept up Richard's neck. That was a temporary instrument. You said Mother said we'd refinance. You promised to notify the line holder, Mr. Hale said, voice even. You did not. You also promised not to encumber the property further. You did. The minute you moved funds to cover Preston Group's margin call, you violated 3 covenants. His gaze softened, not for Richard, but for the gravity of it. I do not gloat. I recite. Vivian pivoted to me then, an instinctive move of a general who senses a flank collapsing. Eleanor, don't be foolish. You cannot possibly want the burden of this house, the staff, the taxes, the home where you told me I didn't belong? I asked quietly. Yes. I intend to be a different kind of steward. She can't kick us out. Clara's voice rose, shrill fear finally bleeding through the sugar. We just got here. I nodded to Mr. Hale, who handed me a smaller envelope. Inside were 2 crisp documents already signed and time-stamped, notice to vacate trespass and a no-contact order drafted but not yet filed. My hands didn't shake when I passed them to the sheriff's deputy, who had been waiting respectful and silent just outside the threshold until called. He stepped forward, hat in hand. Afternoon, folks, he said, voice polite as Sunday. On behalf of the trustee, I'm serving notice. You have 20 minutes to collect personal effects from the foyer only. After that, you'll need to arrange pickup through council. There'll be no disturbances today. 20 minutes, Clara choked. This is barbaric. Barbaric, Mrs. Whitmore echoed softly, is telling a woman to fetch plates at her own wedding table. The line landed with the weight of years. Even the clock seemed to pause before ticking again. Vivian's gaze flicked to the staff who had gathered discreetly in the periphery, the gardener with soil under his nails. Maria from the kitchen wringing her apron. Charles the butler's spine straight out of loyalty, not fear. In their faces, I saw something I had rarely seen in this house: relief. The kind that comes when a storm finally bursts and the air clears. She tried another tactic, reaching for the handle that had always opened every door. Name your price, Vivian said, low, urgent. We will buy it back. I will not be humiliated in my own home. It isn't your home, I replied. I kept my tone gentle. The victory tasted cleaner that way. And there is no price. This house will be run and opened on different terms now. Different terms, Richard echoed dumbly. I looked past him down the corridor toward the sunlit conservatory where I used to hide among the roses to breathe. In the glass, I caught my reflection, older than the bride I'd been, steadier than the woman who had once begged this family to like her. Harold's trust has a mission clause, Mr. Hale said, reading lightly from the page as if it were scripture. Upon appointment of Eleanor Grace as trustee, the property shall be maintained as a residence and community venue for the promotion of education, dignity in labor, and the welfare of household staff. Vivian blinked. Staff. Mrs. Whitmore's hands folded over one another like a benediction. Harold always noticed the hands that built things. He tipped in cash, and in kindness. He asked me once if anyone had ever thanked me for remembering 100 years of other people's habits. She exhaled, eyes wet but clear. This house will do some thanking now. Clara's composure cracked. So I'm supposed to just leave? Her voice pitched high, brittle. After everything he promised me. Promises made on someone else's floorboards don't count, Mrs. Whitmore said, tone neither cruel nor soft, merely true. The deputy cleared his throat. 15 minutes. Vivian straightened as if a rod had been fitted to her spine. Richard, she commanded, say something. He looked at me, really looked, perhaps for the first time in years. There was an emptiness in his expression, the sinkhole left when entitlement collapses. Eleanor, this is extreme. Is it? My voice remained calm, surprising even me. I did what you asked me to do, Richard. I was quiet. I was gracious. I kept our troubles indoors. I brought flowers to cold rooms and laughter to hard dinners. And in return, you brought another woman across my threshold while your mother applauded. I let the truth sit there unadorned. The law is not a temper. It is a mirror. Today, it shows you what you signed. Vivian opened her mouth and closed it, words deserting her for once. She reached for Clara's arm. We are leaving, she said, voice tight. Richard. Now. Clara hesitated, eyes darting to the staircase as if the banister might yet declare her mistress. But the staff did not move. The house did not bend. And the law held steadier than any social season. As they shuffled toward the door, their exit somehow smaller than their entrance, Mrs. Whitmore took one step forward, not to gloat, but to bless the moment with witness. Before you go, she said softly, I'll say what you never allowed me to say aloud in this foyer. This house has always belonged to care, to the hands that dust it and the hands that plant it, to the woman who tried to make it a home when you insisted it stay a museum. She turned toward me and the smallest smile touched her mouth. Today, it belongs to that woman. The deputy opened the door. Autumn air poured in, cool, clean-edged with wood smoke from some distant chimney. Leaves skittered across the threshold and clung to Clara's heel as she stepped into the light. She shook her foot, annoyed, but the leaf refused to let go. For a beat, all three of them, Vivian, Richard, Clara, stood on the stoop staring back at the hall, as if the walls might beg them to return. They won't, Mrs. Whitmore said gently. They never spoke for you. You only taught them to echo. The door closed with a soft final click. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. I let it out slowly, my shoulders lowering as the sound reverberated through rooms that for the first time felt like mine. Behind me, the staff exhaled too, a shared release. Maria wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. Charles cleared his throat and asked, voice thick, if I would like tea. Yes, I said, and my voice did not tremble. But first, would everyone please come to the conservatory? We have announcements to make. I looked at Mrs. Whitmore. Gratitude swelled so fiercely it almost hurt. Stay with me, I asked. She nodded, eyes bright with pride. Always. And the house, no longer a stage set for someone else's story, seemed at last to breathe. The conservatory smelled of roses and damp earth. Afternoon light streamed through the glass panes, scattering across the tiled floor like golden shards. The staff gathered hesitantly at first, Maria twisting her apron, Charles holding a silver tray as though it were a shield, the gardener still dusted with soil. These were the people who had endured Vivian's icy commands, Richard's neglect, and Clara's smug entitlement. Now, for the first time, they stood not as shadows in the periphery, but as witnesses to change. I took my place at the head of the long oak table, the one where Vivian used to hold court over luncheons and bridge games. My fingers traced the wood grain, steadying myself. Then I lifted my chin. "This house is no longer a cage," I said, letting my voice carry through the room. "It is no longer a place where cruelty decides who belongs. From this day forward, it will be a home for those who serve it, for those who need shelter, and for those who have forgotten what dignity feels like." Silence. Then Mrs. Whitmore's eyes glistened and she nodded. The staff followed, tentative at first, then resolute. Richard and Vivian had always believed revenge meant destruction, taking from someone what they most cherished. But as I stood there, I realized my revenge was something else entirely. It was reclamation. It was the quiet satisfaction of building where others had only ever torn down. The next weeks were a blur of transformation. Lawyers finalized the filings that sealed my ownership. Vivian's calls came daily, at first furious and demanding. When I didn't answer, she sent letters pleading one day, threatening the next. Each envelope arrived torn at the corner, as if even the postman wanted nothing to do with them. I kept them unopened in a drawer. Their power ended the moment I chose not to read. Clara, I heard through whispers, tried to cling to Richard. But when the tabloids printed photos of them leaving restaurants together, the narrative shifted. She wasn't the glamorous replacement anymore. She was the woman who had gambled on a man and lost to his ex-wife's foresight. And Richard, well, I caught glimpses of him once or twice in town. He looked smaller somehow, as though life had stripped away his polish and left only a man, unmoored, no longer a husband, no longer the heir to a house that had rejected him. Our eyes met once across a crowded street. He tried to approach, but I turned away. That was my final mercy. Inside the mansion, life bloomed again. I began with the staff. "From now on," I announced one morning, "every person here will have health coverage, retirement contributions, and fair wages. You have held this house together long before I arrived, and you will never again be treated as if you're invisible." Maria burst into tears. Charles bowed, not out of duty but gratitude. The gardener clasped my hands in soil-stained fingers and whispered, "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore stood silently in the back, her eyes shining with a pride that said everything words could not. But my vision stretched beyond the household. My father's voice echoed in memory, "Honesty builds homes." What good was reclaiming this mansion if it served no one but myself? So I called a meeting in the library with local officials, community leaders, and old friends I hadn't seen since my marriage pulled me into the Whitford orbit. "I want to open the mansion as a cultural and educational center," I told them. "A place where women can come to learn skills, find shelter, and rebuild their lives. Too many of us have been told we're not enough, or that our voices don't matter. This house has silenced people long enough. I intend to fill it with voices again." Some were skeptical. Wealth and scandal made for tricky headlines, but others leaned forward, interest bright in their eyes. Within weeks, the plans began. The ballroom, once reserved for galas that served only to bolster Vivian's reputation, echoed with the laughter of children attending after-school programs. The dining hall hosted workshops on financial literacy, resume building, and small business training. Guest rooms became temporary shelters for women leaving difficult marriages, women who needed somewhere safe to breathe. And through it all, Mrs. Whitmore remained my anchor. She organized the staff with military precision, yet her hands were always gentle when she guided a frightened newcomer down the hall. Sometimes I'd find her in the conservatory trimming roses with the same care she had shown me years ago. "You've made this place what it was always meant to be," she told me one evening, her voice soft. "Alive." Not everyone celebrated, of course. Vivian sent emissaries, lawyers, former friends, even Richard once, with hollow eyes. They tried to intimidate me, to tempt me with offers of buyouts and settlements. But each time I refused. "My revenge," I told one particularly smug attorney, "is not that I took their house. It's that I turned their monument to arrogance into a sanctuary of kindness." He had no response. He only packed up his papers and left. One crisp winter night, we held the mansion's first community gala. Not the stiff, glittering affairs Vivian once orchestrated, but a gathering of neighbors, teachers, children, and donors who believed in what we were building. Music floated through the halls, warm and unpretentious. The chandelier light shimmered not with ostentation, but with welcome. I stood at the top of the grand staircase looking out over faces filled with hope. My heart swelled with something richer than any jewel could offer purpose. Mrs. Whitmore joined me, her arm linked through mine. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened. Laughter, conversation, the steady hum of life. "It's the sound of a house finally breathing," she said. And I knew she was right. The true revenge wasn't in their downfall, it was in my rise. It was in proving that dignity could outlast cruelty, that silence could give way to song, and that even the coldest mansion could become a home again. Spring arrived in a rush of blossoms, the kind that draped the Whitford estate in color so vibrant it was almost unrecognizable. Where once the gardens had been manicured for appearances only, now they thrived with wildflowers planted by children from the local school. The air smelled of lilac and fresh soil, alive instead of sterile. On the mansion's front lawn, a banner fluttered in the breeze, the Harold Grace Center for Women and Families, each letter painted bold and proud. For the first time, this house bore a name worthy of honor. Inside, voices filled the halls. Not the clipped tones of high society guests, but the warm cadence of mothers telling stories to their children, volunteers teaching classes, and women laughing together in relief at finally being seen. I walked through the corridors with Mrs. Whitmore by my side, my heels clicking softly on the marble that no longer echoed with emptiness. Everywhere we turned, life flourished. In the former billiard room, a group of women huddled over laptops learning computer skills. In the ballroom, long tables were lined with craft supplies, where children painted bright strokes of joy onto blank canvases. "This is what your father wanted," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice husky. "He couldn't have imagined the scale, but he knew you'd find a way to make a home out of more than wood and brick." Her words made my chest tighten. I think he'd be proud. Not of the mansion, not of the name, but of the women who fill it now. News of the transformation spread. Local newspapers ran stories with headlines like "From Betrayal to Renewal, Woman Turns Family Estate into Community Center." Older women stopped me in town to squeeze my hand and whisper, "You give us hope." Younger women sent letters thanking me for showing that silence doesn't have to be the end. But not everyone rejoiced. Vivian never returned in person, though I heard she still lived in a penthouse across town. Rumors said she attended gatherings less and less, her once powerful circle shrinking without the estate as its centerpiece. Clara disappeared into whispers of failed ventures and new affairs. And Richard, well, I don't know where he is now. Sometimes, when the evening sky turns the same shade of bruised purple as the night I first suspected him, I wonder if he ever thinks about the life he tossed away. But then I remind myself his chapter in my story has ended. One evening, months after the center opened, we hosted our first graduation ceremony for women who had completed skills training. The library, once Vivian's fortress of judgment, was now strung with fairy lights and filled with rows of folding chairs. A woman named Denise, who had come to us trembling after leaving a violent marriage, stood at the podium with tears in her eyes. "I thought I was broken beyond repair," she said. "But this place reminded me that I am not a victim. I am a survivor. And now I am a business owner." Applause thundered. I clapped until my hands stung my throat, thick with emotion. In that moment, I realized the mansion had fulfilled its destiny, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a sanctuary of second chances. Later that night, after the last guest had gone, I found myself alone in the conservatory. The roses bloomed thick and fragrant, their petals open wide to the night air. Mrs. Whitmore joined me quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You've done it," she said, pressing the warm porcelain into my hand. "You turned their cruelty into compassion. That is a victory no one can take from you." I stared at the roses, remembering the countless times I had hidden among them, desperate for air, when the mansion felt suffocating. Now the same room pulsed with life. "It feels strange," I admitted softly. "For so long I thought revenge meant seeing them suffer. But now I see it differently. Revenge is living well, not in spite of them, but beyond them." Mrs. Whitmore's smile was gentle. "Exactly. You took what was meant to break you and built something unbreakable." We sipped in silence, the night alive with crickets outside. Months turned to a year, and the Harold Grace Center became a cornerstone of the community. Women found jobs, families found safety, and children found laughter in halls that had once echoed with scorn. My heart, once bruised and weary, healed in the rhythm of daily purpose. On the anniversary of my divorce, we held a celebration at the center, not to mark loss, but to honor rebirth. Neighbors gathered, music played, and lanterns floated into the night sky, carrying handwritten wishes. As mine lifted upward, I whispered, "Thank you, Dad. Thank you for teaching me what really matters." And as the lantern disappeared into the stars, I felt lighter than I ever had. To those who hear my story, perhaps you carry your own scars. Perhaps you've been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel small in the shadow of others' cruelty. If so, I hope you remember this: you are not powerless. Dignity is stronger than arrogance. Love is louder than betrayal. And even the coldest mansion can be turned into a home again. If my journey resonates with you, share it. If you know someone who needs hope, pass it along. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stay with me, because together we can turn silence into strength, one story at a time.